Breed Smith here is going to be running in Dublin. She's, many of you will know her, she's a lifelong socialist and campaigner. I mean, most recently on climate, but very well known for her work on repeal and reproductive rights for women, as well as pension justice and workers' rights. She's campaigned for many years on these. She was elected first in 2009 as a councillor, and then in 2016. She last year she announced that she would be stepping down in the Dublin South Central constituency as the TD candidate to make room for our younger Councillor Hazel Denartoon there. But I think in People Before Profit, as we saw coming up to these elections, how polarised things have become across Europe, we felt it was really important to have principled left candidates in all the constituencies in Ireland, and we're delighted that Breed agreed to be our candidate, and no other than a principled left candidate here in Dublin. So then also across the way in that mammoth constituency from Donegal to Louth, we have Dr. Brian O'Boyle running. He's our first time candidate in the European elections, but he has been an activist and campaigner for many, many years, first here in Dublin and now in Sligo, where he is a lecturer in economics at the Atlantic Technological University, formerly known as St. Angela's, I think. Yes. And many people still know it as that. He is an author of a number of books, most recently Tax Haven Ireland, and he will be running in that major constituency. And then Cian Prendeville, who's a former councillor in Limerick and who came within 300 votes of a Dáil seat in 2016, also well known as a campaigner down in Limerick around the issues of water charges and healthcare. In particular, Limerick is the University Hospital Limerick and the centralisation of resources into that hospital, and of course he worked very well on repeal in that area as well. We're delighted as well to be joined by no other than Liam Cunningham, and he will say a few words as well, but I think, Breed, you're going to kick off on our manifesto. Yeah,
thanks very much for the introduction, Melissa, and I hope you do take a copy of this and have a look at it. We've put quite a bit of work into this, and it is our manifesto for the elections in the European Union, and covers all of our policies. But I just want to say a word about something Melissa mentioned, and that is the polarisation that has taken place in Europe, and it is really has begun to bite home here in this country. And I think some of the candidates we will see fielded in the European Union elections will be doing so in order just to put arguments against migrants and against Europe itself, and against the unity and the solidarity that we need in these very, very troubled times. I too want to really thank Liam, because since the Palestine struggle against the absolute terrible genocide and famine that's been imposed on the people of Gaza, Liam has been 1,000% with us, marching, speaking, supporting and building a movement that we can try and push back against that genocide and against what's happening across the world. And here Europe has a huge role to play, and they have thus far played a most disgraceful role. In fact, I think it's increasingly becoming more and more disgraceful, the behaviour of the European Union, of Ursula von der Leyen, of the big players there who want to bring us, the whole of Europe, and drag Ireland with them into a classical sort of World War scenario. And in doing so, they're backing Israel to the hilt, absolutely, practically unconditional support for Israel, while at the same time they have no problem meeting till late into the night to decide on imposing sanctions on Iran. We haven't seen a single sanction on the Israeli state, despite the genocide and the imposed famine. So these are the issues that I think we do need principled socialist left-wing fighters and campaigners to go to Europe on, to fight this election on, and to really bring it home that now is a very pivotal moment for the world in general. Now is a pivotal moment for every conscious human being to make decisions around the question of the division that's been sown in terms of dividing us on the basis of racism, and also the impending, what I would argue is an impending scenario where we're being hurtling towards a third world war. We can see the amount of money just in the last couple of days that has been thrown at the Ukraine war, the amount of money that's been thrown towards Taiwan, which indicates that the Americans are thinking, yeah, let's open up a new front against China, and another 28 billion to Israel on top of the 4 billion a year that they give them. So there's huge issues. Not going to say we solve them all, but we can be a voice, and we can be agitators, and we can be in opposition to this agenda, and we have faith in ordinary people right across Europe, and we want to see the mobilisation of people power to halt this agenda.
Thanks very much, Breed. Brian, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I've been teaching economics, as Melissa said, for 20 years, and when I first encountered the discipline, there was sort of two big dogmas that we were all told as students. The first was that you had to trust the private sector. Public means inefficient, private is always more efficient than public, and so you have to privatise. And the second one was, when you privatise, you also have to deregulate and cut taxes. In other words, if you let the free market work, there will be two big benefits. It'll be more efficient, and actually in the end it'll be fairer, because you'll get what they used to call trickle-down economics. So this was the dogma, and it wasn't just in economics lecture halls. Policymakers bought that idea as well. And now over the last sort of 20, 25 years, we've seen the results, and they're the very opposite of what we were promised. Instead of stability in the European economy, we've had crisis after crisis after crisis, Great Recession, cost of living crises. And instead of a trickle-down economy, I would say it's a suction-up economy, where instead of wealth being shared, it's increasingly captured by the elites that are represented by the establishment in Europe. That's what's actually happened to people. And, you know, that matters, because if you look at it in terms of statistics, you can give all sorts of statistics. Like, for example, 600, and they're mostly men, have more wealth. So 600, 1 in a million people have more wealth than 90 million families in Europe, right? And that's hard to get your head around. But it's an amazing, shocking, actually, frankly, it's a disgraceful statistic in my mind. Beyond that, the top 10% have more than the bottom 90%. But just to make it more concrete, there was a report last week from the Youth Council of Ireland, because many young people are at the brunt of the consequences of that deep, unjust inequality, right? And so the report was that 750 young people had been surveyed. And of the 750 people, only 8% said that they could characterise their mental health as good, right? 50% characterised their own mental health as bad. And when asked why their mental health was bad, they said 2/3 said it was because they can't see a positive future, because they're trapped constantly in a cost of living and a housing crisis. This is what was there. You can have a look yourself at the Youth Council report. So, you know, whether it's small and medium farmers, whether it's people on social welfare, whether it's poor people right across the block, and even increasingly middle income people, people recognise that this is a rigged game. It's rigged in favour of the top 1% of society, and the consequences are devastating, because in the individual lives of people, lives are being thwarted and lost, and people are, you know, losing their potential. But politically, it's opening up the ground for all of the, you know, the destructive politics of the far right, the idea that somehow all of the anxiety you have can be misdirected towards people who never make decisions, that the powerful are somehow not to blame, but that the powerless need to be tackled, and tackled all the time. And to my mind, the EU has a deep responsibility for that. They caused the inequality that has now led to all sorts of crises around our climate, crisis around people's lived experience, a crisis of the far right, a crisis of democracy. And we are going to stand proudly against those ideas in this election, and we're not going to accept the idea that we have to have this rigged game. So you won't be surprised to know, and I'll finish on this, that our manifesto has the complete opposite trajectory. Instead of weakening workers' rights, we want to strengthen workers' rights, and we're very proud of saying that. Instead of saying we should have less regulation on big business, we want to regulate the vulture funds. We want to make sure that they can't cause the havoc that they're causing. Instead of saying let's trust the private sector, we would say if you want to solve climate change, build a national energy company. If you want to solve the housing crisis, build a national housing construction company and get them to work to solve our big problems. So we have an optimistic sense that what can be done in Europe through solidarity and through social justice is possible, and we're putting our manifesto out on that basis.
Thanks very much, Brian. Keane?
Yeah, so I'm going to speak to three aspects of our manifesto in terms of Palestine, militarisation and Fortress Europe, and try to give an example of what we mean when we say a Europe. We stand for a Europe for people, not profit. What would a socialist Europe, how would it be different? So first of all, on the issue of Palestine, I think what we're seeing now is a genocide in Gaza, and the reality is that the EU is on the wrong side of that. In Ireland and in Europe, people like to think and talk as if the EU is somehow the progressive one compared to the US, and that actually it's just the US that is funding and arming Israel. About 1/3 of all weapons that were sold to Israel last year were sold to them by EU countries. The EU is arming this genocide that is taking place. In fact, in terms of trade relations, the EU is Israel's number one trading bloc. We are more significant, more important to Israel economically than the US in that way. But also in terms of the whitewashing of Israel. The EU has led the charge in trying to whitewash Israel and present it as some sort of normal state, when it is far from that. Through things like special trade relationships, essentially giving Israel access to the EU market as if it was an EU state, involving them and allowing them to apply for EU grants research through things like the Horizon Europe project, which is about 100 billion euros worth of investment in research and development. Technically, it's not meant to be spent on military research, but since 2007, they've included the option of what they call security funding as part of that, which has seen EU money being used to fund Israeli military companies in developing the Pegasus security or phone hacking software, which has been used. EU funding went to supporting the development of the Pegasus phone hacking software, which is being used to hack the phones of journalists, European Union journalists, as well. So that EU money is going to that. EU money has also gone to funding the development of Israeli military companies developing the drones, which we are now seeing being used to devastating effect against the people in Gaza. So part one of what we're saying, or one part of what we're saying in terms of this, is that we will be pushing in the European Parliament to end that, to end that special treatment of Israel, to end those sales of weapons and cut them out from all of those deals, as well as was mentioned, opposing von der Leyen's campaign to be reappointed European President. Secondly, on a similar thing is the militarisation of the EU, which I think we're seeing gathering a pace now. Similarly, people in Ireland and Europe like to think that the military-industrial complex is something that happens in the US, but actually the military-industrial complex is very much real in the EU. The European armaments spending last year, military spending, was €250 billion. EU states spent €250 billion on weapons last year. That is insane. Just like sometimes million, billion, trillion gets confusing. How much we're talking? Just to put an example on that, 1 million seconds ago was about 12 days ago. Simon Harris was coming to the end of his first week as Taoiseach. 1 billion seconds ago was about 32 years ago. Simon Harris was coming to the end of junior infants. 1 trillion seconds ago was about 30,000 years ago. We were coming to the end of the Ice Age. Agriculture had not been invented. We didn't have settlements. It was 20,000 years before humans were settled on the island of Ireland. Ireland wasn't even an island at that stage. So when you're talking about €250 billion being spent on weapons, these are eye-watering amounts of money being spent by the EU as part of this military-industrial complex, and it's growing. The push towards for Ireland to join NATO, the push for more EU states to join NATO, the push towards PESCO and EU army, all of that is part of this pushing for militarisation. So, yeah, in the European Parliament we will be fighting to defend neutrality, to oppose the EU developing its military project, and to demand that we should be spending that money on healthcare and not warfare. We should be building homes, not bombing homes. And finally, on Fortress Europe, again, I think another example of where the EU is more like Trumpian vision of the world than we care to admit. So Trump talks about and wanted to build a wall and lock children in cages. The EU is doing those things. The EU now is proposing to detain refugee children's, refusing to allow them out to school or anything like that. They have built fences, but also have built a watery grave in the form of the Mediterranean. In the last 10 years, 30,000 people have lost their lives on coffin ships trying to get into the EU through the Mediterranean. That's almost as many people as have died in the war in Gaza. These are massive numbers of people, and those who have tried to rescue drowning refugees have faced criminal charges. One in my constituency, Sean Binder, a man from Kerry who went over and tried to rescue drowning individuals in Greece, faces legal charges and is up on trial for that. That is how brutal the EU's brutal reality of the Fortress Europe. And what we're seeing there is the same as Trump tries to do. Billionaire elite trying to blame refugees for the crises they created. That's exactly what the EU is trying to do. For the housing crisis, the health crisis that their austerity policies have created, now they're trying to blame refugees for those. So we will be rejecting that divide and rule approach. That attempt by the corporate elite and their far-right friends to divide workers and have us pitted against each other, and instead we will be fighting to build strong fighting trade unions, active mass movements of working class people for housing, for healthcare, to demand jobs, homes and decent standard of living for all workers.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all three of our candidates. And now I'm delighted to introduce Liam Cunningham, who'll say a few words, and thanks very much for joining us here today.
No problem. So I'm down here as a majorly concerned citizen. If any good things have come out, I think, especially with the Palestine thing, is, I know it's a strange thing to say, is that the masks are off. We know who the warmongers are because they've come out of hiding and come out from the weasel words that we've been hearing. We know who they are, and anybody that I come across are astonished by the support, virtually unequivocal support of the US. It's just astonishing. We can see the other positive stuff is the universities in America are going bananas at the minute, and you can see that this rejection of this apartheid regime, the genocide, is finally the tide is turning much later than it should have been. Another thing about candidates going forward, I was kind of, I hasten to use the word radicalised. I was, for anybody that doesn't know, I should have been in the Stardust that night. In fact, I was out on my motorbike and I managed to find my sister and her best friend in Jervis Street Hospital before it was a shopping centre. My other sister should have been there, but she was waylaid and went to a party instead. And I witnessed the kind of abandonment by the state, of which they apologised for yesterday, of these unfortunate people. I felt a little bit guilty about, or would have felt guilty if I'd have gone and joined that. I thought it was much more important that the mothers, brothers, daughters and sisters take centre stage on that, and I didn't want to be a distraction from that, which is why I didn't do it, but I have talked about it in the past. One of the other things that I find astonishing, and I think most of the people in this room will have had, by the brothers, the nuns and various teachers in their history classes, had it battered into them about absentee landlords that we spent 700 years trying to remove from this country. And I watched for the last 20 or 30 years Fine Gael and Fine Gael inviting them back in, and we can see the result of that. I have children who, two of them still with me and two others over there who were living with us for 10 years, who are a perfect example of the social contract being danced upon, that if you work hard, you go to college, you do your bit, you educate yourself, and you're passionate about what you're doing, the reward should be somewhere to lay your head down on a pillow. And for that to be denied to them, I think is obscene. And I think that was most definitely a policy decision, because, as your good self said, that the free market was supposed to pile them high and sell them cheap, which they didn't do. They restricted access, which raised the prices, and therefore excluded the very people that were here for the sake of a return on a spreadsheet in Germany or America or wherever it may be, and that I think that is the government's abandoning the people that they're paid to represent, and and it's absolutely obscene that they use neoliberalism to justify it, and I'm sick of it. So that's basically the reason that I'm up in front of your good selves. Now I'll keep it brief because you people are a lot more educated about this stuff than I. I'm merely raging that we've
we are as well.
Yeah. So and I think and what we need in Europe is people who are going to be a thorn in the side of attempts to undermine. And one more thing, our neutrality is incredibly important, especially at this stage when the warmongers have the voice of the world. And I think there should be a quadruple lock, not a triple lock. I think it should go to referendum that under no circumstances will our neutrality be questioned. I think we should be the Switzerland of Western Europe in its theoretical form. We all know what that means. But I think it should be written in the DNA of Ireland that we will not assist any attempt to wage war on people, and we should be the conscience of Europe because of our history of occupation and oppression. It's beholden upon us to be able to stand up and be able to shame people when they're attempting to start wars. That's about it.
Very good. Thanks so much.
Thanks a million, Liam, and thanks so much for coming along to show your support. Now, questions, anybody?
Hi.
Yourself and then yourself.
Hi, I'm Stephanie from News Talk. Liam, if I could just ask you two questions, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Firstly, on the Stardust, I covered the inquest. I saw you put up online unlawful killing, and if you could just maybe elaborate on, you're saying that has prompted part of your anger, that you feel it's important to be here today, and I think you said you were meant to be there that night.
Yeah.
And then, well, sure. Look, I'll let you answer that first before I go on.
I'll answer with Charlie Bird. I was at the Remembrance a few years ago when the present owner of the Stardust paid for a memorial to be put up there, which seems so sad that should happen, and. Charlie Bird was magnificent. He stood up and said, if this had happened in Donnybrook, if it had happened in Annabelle's, it would have been sorted out in a couple of years. And the working class of Coolock were abandoned. They were under Haughey and his family members. And I think it was Anthony Keegan said she was told, look, go home, your kids are gone. But I mean, just horrific stuff. And it's appalling that the people that were supposed to represent us essentially abandoned for 43 years, abandoned, and that's I think that, and I was about 1920 at the time. That's the first time I thought about them and us. It was I couldn't believe it that these people that we only ever saw knocking at the door when there was an election coming up, when and said, look. And Charlie did it all the time. He bought a lawnmower for a woman across the road when I was there. He bought votes, and when it came to it, he didn't want to know. And I think Charlie Bird was absolutely right. And it was very, very difficult for the people from Coolock and the families and the victims to say if this had happened in Donnybrook. It would have seemed like some sort of bad blood or chip on the shoulder working class thing, and it took somebody like Charlie to say it because he was an honest broker, and it was absolutely true and absolutely obvious, and the fact that we got to that stage is an awful reflection on where politics was and where politics is at the minute, that the people that are supposed to represent the best for their are turn to the free market, turn to vulture funds, to international pressure instead of doing because they want to be in the big club. That's as far as I can say. They just want to be in the big club, and I definitely think all this talk about let's have a look at the triple lock and all this sort of thing. I absolutely, and call me a cynic if you want, I think these boys are trying to feather the nest that they're going to be invited when they're out of power. Is that they're looking for jobs in Europe. I think it's a total disconcern for the people that they're supposed to represent.
And thank you for that. And then secondly, you're a huge actor, and anytime I go onto social media and stuff, Hollywood can be quite silent on what's going on in Gaza. Do you make any pleas, or do you speak to fellow actors or why they're so quiet when their voices are so powerful?
Listen, I can't speak for other people. There's a lot of people. I was delighted to be invited to the IFTAs the other night, and I had a huge number of people come up and whisper in my ear, "Well done, we really respect what you're doing." What concerns me is that the people who do care and aren't doing anything, in my opinion, are worse than the people who don't care. That's what I find as sad, and that it sits well with them that they can ignore. I just can't ignore it. I've been on these marches for 30 or 40 years when the occasional marches were coming up for Palestine. Just no one ever noticed me because I wasn't on the media channel. And I think look, you have to listen. The internet doesn't forget. When this comes round, when the ICJ and the ICC hopefully do their work honourably, it's going to come out, and the people who didn't talk, it's not going to be forgotten. It's live streamed, this genocide, and the option to say, "Well, I didn't know," is not an option. You did know, and you did nothing, and you stayed quiet. I need to be able to look in the mirror, and that's why I speak.
Thanks, yourself.
Louise Byrne, the Irish I do have political questions, but just Liam, just to follow up the start question about the Stardust.
Yeah.
What do you think should be the next step? There's some calls for, I guess, a criminal investigation into this and to look at that side of it. There's calls for more supports for the family. What do you think should happen next? Now we've had the inquiry and we've had the apology from the Taoiseach.
Listen, it's for cleverer people than me to come up with that. The fact that they got the apology finally after 43 years, the disgrace is it took that long. That's the absolute disgrace. I can understand that you have to get through and find out what the problem is and all that sort of stuff. But the whitewashing that went on before this, that has led to and this is where we are now, and that's all credit to the people who were relentless, who were manhandled out of the Dáil, who weren't allowed in, who were ignored, who were poo-pooed, who were after this. Look, we need a memorial, obviously. It's the biggest loss of life in the state's history, I believe. That was. It would be at this moment in time to talk about any sort of monetary, offer. It is distasteful to talk about now. That's down the line, and that will come on the back of any criminal charges. Against the person at the beginning who said his conscience is clear.
And just on the elections, Bree, can I just ask you, if you did get elected, or either of your colleagues here got elected, what, I'm guessing you're not going to be in the EPP or ALDE, what grouping would you put yourself in? And then for Brian and Cian, if either of you are elected, can you rule out now a run for the Dáil and co-opting someone else into your European seat?
GUI NGL, isn't that how you say it, Paul?
Yeah, it's just called the left.
It's called the left.
The left.
It's easier. Yeah.
Gwendol.
That was the question.
That was the question.
Yeah, okay.
And then
And
for
then
the two
for the
gentlemen.
other two,
Yeah.
Brian.
I have no intention of running for the Dáil. If I get elected to the European Parliament, that'll be I'll serve the full term and try to use it as a platform to build the movements. When I was a councillor, I used the platform of the council to build the fight against the water charges. As an MEP, I would use that platform similarly to build mass movements in the communities. I won't be disappearing off to Brussels. I'd be building campaigns to reopen the small A&Es that have been shut in the Midwest and on those other issues, but I wouldn't be standing for
I mean it with no offence, but you don't really do that in Brussels. Like,
Uh-huh.
is that not more of a Dáil?
Well, exactly, that's my point, is that when I was on the council, water charges, in a sense, that's a Dáil issue, but we used our position on the council to build a mass movement on the water charges. We fought and we won on that, and in the same way, for us, we see these positions as being flat platforms to build mass people power movements and to support those campaigns. I think that's how real change is delivered. Of course, we'll also be fighting tooth and nail on every policy a proposal that comes before the European Parliament, trying to hold von der Leyen to account and the EPP and ALDE, Renew Europe and all, to account for their brutal policies. But I will not be disappearing into the corridors of Brussels. I will continue to be active on the streets of Ireland South.
You have to go to Brussels sometime.
I'll have to go to
Very good beer.
And are you staying for a 5-year term in Brussels, or are you going to...
Yeah, I mean, the situation that we are is that we have a very good councillor locally in Sligo who is selected to run for the Dáil in the next general election, and I'm very happy for that to be the situation. So if I was elected, yes, 5-year term and all the rest of it, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else yourself?
Yeah, I've read the manifesto like you asked us to.
Speed reader.
This European Union stuff sounds like a terrible bit of business. Can you talk to me a bit more about what being an EU critical party is while rejecting the Tory Brexit option?
Was that for Breeze or for
Yeah, Breeze.
I don't mind. Well, first of all, we do reject the Tory Brexit option, and despite what is said about us, we're not pro-Brexiteers, but we are very critical of how the European Union is structured, and I think Brian did in his introduction cover that a bit to show that it's built on lobbying, companies lobbying the Parliament. The Parliament itself doesn't have all the power. It appoints commissioners who aren't elected. Like, people need to know that Ursula von der Leyen is unelected but has a huge amount of power, and that these so-called democratic institutions are increasingly becoming anti-democratic and undemocratic, and therefore there has to be a critique of how that is structured and how it is set up, without saying that we want to exit from the European Union project. We want to be in it, criticise it, reform it, change it, and what we want to see is an alternative European Union, one that stands for people and not for profit, that stands for peace and not for war.
Either of the other on that?
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish, because obviously one narrative in the world now is that what you need to do is put, quote unquote, your own force, nation first, stronger, higher borders, block people out. And it's all geared around a sort of a divisiveness and basically ultimately a racist set of policies. We're always and have been internationalists, and so we're trying to stake a clear position that says we see the solution to problems as international solutions. But at the moment, the international organisations are set up for the rich, and they're rigged against ordinary people. So you have how do you actually navigate that then? And the best way we can see is to be inside, but arguing strongly that the current setup is not possible in terms of solving problems for ordinary people. So that's what it means to be EU critical.
Do you want the last word on that? Or?
I think
no.